Well, I'm going to press on just a little bit further with that. Actually, just talk about minority language, which is something about which in which you've got a particular interest indeed. And I think there's something like maybe 7,000 minority languages in the world, but I've read that maybe half of them are in danger of disappearing. And I mean, it might seem, but of course we must lament that. But why should we lament that? Is it simply the same way that we might lament the loss of a species of mammal or something like that? What are the great losses involved in the minority languages? And can you tell us anything more about the condition of minority language, apart from the Irish?
You know, as a linguist and a lover of diversity in all its forms, it makes me very sad to think of languages no longer being spoken as vernaculars. It is, I think, an inevitable process. There's you know, language. What's great about it is it really is other to us. I mean, it really is like nature or something. It isn't ours, and it jumps spontaneously out of us. And I don't know how much you can really engineer that. I do feel that there's a fundamental spirit of linguistic diversity of some kind that is irrepressible. And so even if specific languages or dialects are no longer spoken as community languages, other forms of linguistic diversity jump up to take their place. I think it is an ecosystem that just, and that could be in, you know, local turns of phrase or color of speech. I mean, I think it is, it is a very basic and irrepressible component of human life and human pleasure, linguistic diversity, and in some form, it's always going to reassert itself.
I guess that has to be good news then, that we're not all heading for some grand, bland homogeneity of...
I mean, I hope. You do sometimes then click through Twitter, which I don't do often, but I do sometimes have a look, and I do worry that a certain kind of flatness, you know, people have written about this, you know, in translation studies, that a certain kind of flatness of language makes them more easily exportable. And, you know, there are some studies, for example, of Italian novels now that suggest that it's becoming kind of pre-Englished, that they're sort of avoiding turns of phrase would be difficult to translate into English and Japanese. They did in Japanese too. I mean, there is some sense that language is being flattened out. So I have that worry for literary language, but spoken language, I don't think so. I feel that people always want to entertain each other and, you know, in ways court each other socially with linguistic vitality, and that isn't something that we can lose. But it's something we should certainly cherish, you know, not take for granted. But I don't think I can see that in itself going.
Come in. Can I ask a rather more broad question about what we're supposed to be speaking about this evening, and that indeed is the future of Irish studies? Are the glory days over? I mean, where do you see it's going? What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? I mean, what right now were you given some sort of powers? What would be called upon? What needs to be brought into the thing? What can re-energize it? How can it increase?
Well, first, I think you'd be one of the first people I'd ring if I was given those powers to ask for advice. So, but now, Irish studies, as we know it now, I mean, the field that we are now was invented, to use, you know, the title of Declan Kybert's, you know, seminal book. It was invented in the 80s and 90s, and by a distinct group that had a set of complex relationships amongst themselves, and like all great cultural and scholarly innovations. And we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have Irish studies without that. Sure. Obviously, it was of its time. Everything is of its time, and you know, their work is in many ways, I think, eternal. I don't think, it's not that I think it goes out of date, but how we conceive of the field obviously has to be different. I think, I'm going to repeat myself, it's not by running after news cycle issues that are in the contemporary news cycle, I fear that makes us less relevant rather than more. But I think, for example, historiography has had undergone enormous changes in recent years. So whole new approaches to history are really possible. I mean, the reevaluation of 16th and 17th century Ireland is, that's something that there's an enormous amount of interesting work that could be done, both in literature and in history. And people are doing it. I mean, I'm not saying they're not, but I think there are huge, and the 19th century, which has recently been a field of great interest for people. There really is a lot of new stuff waiting for us in the past. And that's what I would embrace, I think. And I would, as a third and last time I'll say it, I would de-emphasize the contemporary.
Okay.